Brendan Nelson is one of those rare breed of politicians who've had a real job before entering politics. A doctor who would go on to lead the Australian Medical Association. He's also one of those rare breed of politicians who's held membership to both major parties. But it was his work with the magnificent Australian War Memorial in Canberra which served our knowledge of war and our warriors superbly. Today he's entered a whole new battlefield. Brendan Nelson, thank you so much for your time.
My great pleasure, Chris.
Timing, they say, is everything, Brendan. I know you signed up for Boeing, I think it was in January, and then within about a month and a half, the entire aviation industry was on its knees. You didn't plan that, of course?
No, of course not, Chris. It's a great company and very diverse in terms of commercial aviation, space, military, a whole range of things, but none of us anticipated what would happen. And of course, aviation is at the front end of the economic impacts of the pandemic.
What does it mean for you, running the Australian side of the operation, a massive global company? What does it mean for you? Are you working more on the defence side of the Boeing product, or are you simply in planning mode for when aviation gets on its feet again and they are looking for Boeing to help them out?
Well, Chris, across Australia, Boeing has nearly 4,000 employees, and we've got a number of businesses in Australia. So we have a manufacturing plant in Melbourne, which is resin-infused composite fabrication, high-tech, high-end manufacturing, but making components for the wings of planes. So for obvious reasons, we've had to go through the very difficult process of redundancies in Melbourne. But mainly up in Queensland, our defence business, thanks to the very significant investment by the Australian government in defence, the defence business is going extremely well. We're in the process of recruiting people to defence. We have a drone company, In Situ Pacific, which is also going very well, and then a number of other businesses that have a mixed story within Australia. But one of the things that I'm certainly looking forward to, and we've been working with the Australian government on this, is this increased investment in Australian high-end manufacturing.
Yep.
And we've also got some announcements coming up we'll be making with the Queensland government about working in partnership with high-end assembly and manufacturing to create more jobs.
Do you think the kind of money that the federal government is talking about is enough? Is it the first of many? Will they require propping up the manufacturing seeds a little bit more? How will this play out? There's been some criticism about the amount of money not being enough.
Well, Chris, you see it every day. The people that are always saying the government should be giving more money to all sorts of programs. I think we need to understand that our governments are basically taking us through a period that we have not experienced in our lifetime. Now, you and I lived through a recession in the late 80s, early 90s, but this is, dare I say, even more negatively impacting our economy and our society, this pandemic. And it's easy for some people to be critical of the government. I'm very supportive of what the federal government is doing in this, and I would expect the Prime Minister has foreshadowed, I think, $1.5 billion specifically for investment into manufacturing in Australia, securing our supply lines. The government's identified 6 areas for priority, which includes space and defence, which particularly is something obviously Boeing has an interest in. And I would not be surprised if further down the line, if the government believed it needed to invest more in our manufacturing space, it would. So at this stage, I think we need to get behind the government, support this, and we as a company certainly will be doing everything we can, not just individually as Boeing, but also I'm the chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia, and through the Business Council of Australia, we'll be doing everything we can to support the government to make this work.
So you'd be riding the infection figures as closely as you'd be riding the balance sheet, wouldn't you? Given the fact that you are hoping and praying that aviation returns, that the planes get back into the sky, that we get to a near new normal, maybe early part of 2021, if not maybe 2020, the end of 2020.
Well, we certainly are, Chris. And aviation, to quote Dave Calhoun, the chief executive of Boeing, the Boeing company, has basically gone off a cliff, commercial aviation. And in some parts of the world, domestically within China, it's running at around 70%. Domestically within China, the US is running at around 30%. We, as you know only too well, have border closures here. They now look as if they're starting to open up. And it's clear that Australians want to fly, they want to travel. So, but everything that we do, and I know the aviation sector, the regulators, everything we do has to be governed by health advice. We've been working very carefully with the aviation sector and the regulators in Australia on initiatives to give people confidence in terms of flying, and everything from the time you leave home to getting to the airport, to checking in, getting on the plane, what happens on the plane, the very, very high-tech filtration systems in planes which significantly reduce the transmission of viruses, bacteria and other things on planes. So when we will eventually get back to a degree of normality, none of us really knows, but it's heavily dependent on the vaccine and vaccines being available, which of course we expect next year, hopefully in the first half of the year.
But to take an optimistic view, it is conceivable, is it not, Brendan, that we could have international travel bubbles like to New Zealand, to Singapore and other places that are willing to talk to the states and talk to the federal government about this, maybe as early as the end of 2020 for that Christmas, New Year break?
Well, obviously all of us have an ambition, as soon as safe to do so and practical to do so, to have a travel bubble. But that, of course, is entirely in the hands of our federal and state governments in Australia, in the hands of the New Zealand government, the regulators and the health authorities. We've seen now that essentially we've got this wave in Victoria now very much coming under control. We've seen now essentially close to no community transmission in most of the rest of Australia. We're now seeing more speculation around that travel bubble, Chris, with New Zealand and perhaps some of the Pacific Island nations, and possibly in the medium term some of the other countries. But we need to hasten slowly. We need to make sure that we don't put anybody at risk whilst recognising the health, social and human consequences of economic shutdown.
Now, let's rewind the tape a little bit. There aren't too many politicians, as I mentioned in the opening to the program, who've had memberships to both of the major parties. Your dad was a unionist. It probably followed that you would begin as a member of the Labor Party. That was as early as 13 years of age. And then you promised never to vote for Liberal, and then you promised never to vote for anyone but Liberal. What was the turning point?
Well, basically, in my family, Chris, my mother was a very devout Irish Catholic. We were raised as Catholics. My father was very much a non-Catholic. And my mother got the religion, my father got the politics, and Dad was very steeped in the politics of the Australian Labor Party. He was a Marine Chief Steward. He was a delegate for the Cooks and Stewards Union, as it was then, in his working life. And so in my teens, supported by my father, of course, I joined the Labor Party. But it was actually toward the end of my medical training, I started to come up against this virulent anti-doctor rhetoric that was coming out of elements of the Labor Party. This was back in the early to mid-80s, and that started to really needle me. And then when I was in Hobart in 86, 87, I'd actually gone into practice with David Crean, Simon Crean's brother. Mm-hmm. The Crean family are magnificent people, I must say, Chris. David and I were in practice together, and the Hawke government really was running a very anti-government agenda. I had borrowed money to set up the medical practice, and then we had to have interactions with unions, and I realised, my father had said to me when I was a young boy, he said, if you care for working people, you support the labour movement. That was his message. But as I got older, and I said to him, in fact in 1987 I voted Liberal, I voted for John Howard, I said to him, Dad, it's not that simple. If you really care for working people, and people that have neither a voice nor influence, you've got to do everything you can to encourage people to get out of bed, to work hard, to take a risk. We rely very heavily on men and women in this country who have second mortgages on their houses and do all sorts of things to create wealth.
Yeah.
And so
and
essentially...
jobs.
Yeah, that's right. And I saw elements. In fact, my dad, when he retired, he said to me, son, he'd ended up as chief steward purser for Australian National Line. He said, son, the union that I've supported all of my life, I'm ashamed of. He said the behaviour of what is now the MUA, he said the behaviour is not something that I can condone. So,
that's interesting.
So anyway, you've got to have an open mind in life, Chris, and along with Ronald Reagan, Winston Churchill and others, as I got older, I realised that life's not as simple as you believe when you're young.
You were in opposition, or you were an opposition leader for a little over 9 months. Was it true that when you put your hand up to run for the leadership, that some people told you, don't do it, Brendan, give it to Malcolm Turnbull because we want to get rid of him? Is that a true story?
Well, it is. In fact, quite a few of my then colleagues said to me, look, Brendan, whoever becomes the leader of the party now will not be our next Liberal Prime Minister. We need to get Malcolm through the system, and the best way to do it is to make him leader now.
So like flush him out.
And well, essentially, that was a sentiment that I encountered very much, and I had people who voted for Malcolm Turnbull on that basis. And it was said to me by more than a few, look, Brendan, just stay in reserve. And there are two things, Chris. Malcolm had come into our cabinet in the last year of the Howard government in 2007, and I'd seen enough to worry me. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is that I thought it was critically important that we embrace, be proud of and hold on to the Howard legacy whilst recognising overreach in industrial relations, in work choices, and that we had been monstered on the symbolism of climate change. But essentially that the Howard government had done an extraordinary job for this country, and we needed to be proud of that legacy and to support it. And in life, you have to have a go. We were all gobsmacked when Peter Costello said that he would not accept the leadership of the party. And even though Peter was very strongly supportive of me, Peter's presence and continuing presence used by elements of the media was one of the many things that I had to deal with.
OK, is it true then that when you won that ballot and became the opposition leader, that Malcolm stormed into your office without invitation and berated you very loudly?
Yes, it's true. I can say it. It was reported on the front page of The Australian. It certainly didn't come from me. But, I had one. It was announced, and the first thing I did was stand up and turn around to thank Malcolm for his campaign and so on and so forth, and it was clear from looking at him he wasn't very happy. And I spoke to the party room. I thanked John Howard in absentia for what he had done for us through government, Alexander Downer, Mark Vaile. I told the party how immensely proud and grateful I was for being given the leadership of the party. I regard it as an immense honour, of course. I sought their support for ratification of the Kyoto Protocol, and I explained to them in the broad what my approach to the leadership would be. And I was up in my office in Parliament House, actually, and I was in this room with Brian Loughnane, who was then the Federal Director of the party, and Julie Bishop's Chief of Staff, Murray Hanson, and two of my staff. And the door was closed, and then suddenly it opened. And it opened with such force, it started to come back and close on the person who'd opened it, and it was Malcolm. And he was not happy. And I won't be too specific, but he was very, very strong in his language toward me. And I simply said to him, look, Malcolm, thank you for telling me what you think. I can only imagine what you're going through at the moment, the emotions, but in future, if you'd like to see me, please make an appointment and certainly knock on the door. So,
but what an exercise in disrespect. I don't want to drag you into comments about Malcolm Turnbull. We're all rid of him, and I'm glad we are. But having said that, an episode of great disrespect to the new opposition leader, his new boss. I can't believe it. I do want to talk to you at length about your passion, your great passion, 7 years at the Australian War Memorial. But can I say, just before we get to the nitty-gritty of all of that, the idea that we would have a last post ceremony at the Australian War Memorial on a daily basis was introduced by you. What an inspired idea.
Oh, well, thank you, Chris. When I was Australia's ambassador to NATO and the European Union in Belgium, I went to the Menin Gate in Ypres many times, and For those of you who don't know, Ypres is a medieval city. It's in Flanders in Belgium, and it was at the epicentre of one of the three major battles of the First World War, basically Passchendaele, if you like. And the British built this magnificent stone arch on the medieval wall around it and inscribed into it the names of 55,000 dead and missing British and Commonwealth soldiers, including over 6,000 Australians. And the last post is played there every night since 1928 at 8 o'clock. So I used to go down there. In fact, my very last night in Belgium as the ambassador, my wife and I went, and the chairman of the Last Post Association, Benoit Mottry, leaned over and he said, "Ambassador, this is your 74th visit." And I said, "Benoit, have you been counting them?" And he said, "We didn't at first, but we noticed you were coming more often than anyone we've ever seen." And I said, "Mate, if it was in Belgium, in Brussels, instead of an hour and a half drive, I would have come every night."
Yeah.
And so when I got to the Australian War Memorial, I stood in the commemorative area on my second day. And at that time, at the end of the day, they would someone would read the history of the last post and then play the last post. And on the next night, they'd give you the history of the lament and play the pipes. And I said to the staff, I said, "We're going to do the last post, but we're going to do a lot more." And so we started. The very first one was on the 17th of April 2013. We told the story of Robert Pote, who'd been killed in Afghanistan only a year earlier. And so we have the Australian flag behind the lectern. We give people the history of the War Memorial, the vision of its founder, Charles Bean. A piper and a bugler come out together from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier and stand either side. The lament is played while wreaths are laid. And then a uniformed member of the Australian Defence Force then reads the story of just one of those 102,700 names of men and women who've given their lives for us, that person's life, how they joined the military, what they did, how they died. And then the last post is played in the ode recited. And
brilliant.
We put a webcam on it, Chris, and it is. And when and you give credit to me, it's not me. It's a team of people. You only ever do things if you've got the support and belief of others.
You're being a little too humble, but let's leave it there.